All right, so today we are going to be talking about the brothers Niebuhr, but I wanted to begin. I know I've been talking a lot. I felt like I really had a lot I wanted to say about virtue ethics these past couple of weeks, but I haven't given any opportunity for kind of back and forth and for you to engage with one another, and I wanted to get back to doing that today and give you about 5 minutes right now to think and talk, find somebody close enough to you to talk with about this case, which unfortunately is going to sound all too familiar. I actually taught a class on pandemic ethics during the pandemic, and it was like unfolding right then. It was like before we had vaccines, and so these are the things that we were talking about. But I think that it might provide an interesting angle for thinking about how Christian realism and responsibility ethics reaches the ground, let's say. So there's the case. Deadly pandemic, no effective treatment, masks are protective, you're the mayor, you've got enough for 10% of your population. What are you going to do with these masks? How are you going to distribute them? And oh, by the way, you're up for re-election very soon. So give you about 5 minutes to talk about that. We'll then bring back a few ideas into the class, and we'll circle back to it at the very end of the class period. Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, a really rich conversation. Obviously, we have had an opportunity to think in detail about these questions over the past 3 years. Keep all of this kind of floating around in your mind, and again, we'll try to come back to it at the end of the class and see if you have further reflections that might be filtered through what Reinhold or H. Richard Niebuhr or Levin actually might have to say about how to think about the ethical situations that we face. So our topic for today is responsibility ethics and Christian realism. And with these two Niebuhr brothers, Reinhold and H. Richard, and also the conclusion of Levin's book, where we get the clearest sense of his own position, which is very deeply shaped by both of the Niebuhrs. It is in some sense a form of Christian realism, and in another sense it's a form of responsibility ethics. But I actually want to begin by spending just a few minutes with Saidiya Hartman and her some of the core ideas in her book Scenes of Subjection, book from 1997. And this is not a book of theological ethics, but it has very important things to say about responsibility, and that I think are very worth juxtaposing to Christian realism and to responsibility ethics as we try to think about this whole theme of responsibility. So she's looking at racial subjugation during slavery and especially the Reconstruction era in the South, and she makes a very important point about how the discourse of responsibility functioned in that context. So interestingly, I think we might argue that she could be sort of an honorary realist in the Niebuhrian sense, even though she's using terminology that come from or are central to H. Richard Niebuhr's reflection. She has in mind responsibility in a very troubling sense. So very briefly, this is the key point. So the formerly enslaved, who had no rights, no civil rights, were now declared to be responsible moral agents and citizens with rights, bearers of civil rights. They could enter into contracts, and then they could be bound to the terms of those contracts because they were considered to be now free and responsible agents. So all of that, the notion that the formerly enslaved were now recognized as free and responsible agents, of course, sounds like a good thing. It sounds like progress, moral progress, moving in the right direction. But in fact, what happened, I just had this up to sort of give you a visual of the sharecropper experience, but basically what happened is that the formerly enslaved were induced to sign contracts for wages that were so low that they couldn't pay for the clothing and supplies and so on that they needed, and they got those from the company store. And so then at the end of the day, they made less than they needed to pay for the goods that they had gotten at the company store. So they ended up in a form of indentured servitude, right? They now were theoretically free. They were theoretically able to make a contract or able not to make a contract. But of course, in reality, they had to make these contracts because they had to make a living in some way. And they ended up in a new form of slavery by another name. But now they could be blamed for their own enslavement. They could be blamed for their own servitude. They, as responsible agents, were now responsible for having acted irresponsibly, so to speak, right? I mean, in fact, what would we say about about this? They were in such a constrained situation that the question of what responsibility looks like under this sort of constraint is a major question mark. So keep that in mind. I hope to be able to circle back to that at the end of class in relationship, once we've kind of have H. Richard Niebuhr's notion of responsibility under our belts. But for now, I want to turn to the Niebuhrs, and we are, of course, sitting in Niebuhr Hall. So which Niebuhr is this that we're sitting in? Anybody know? Oh. Yes, this is, there is a sign out there, so it's not that hard to find out. This is H. Richard Niebuhr Hall, dedicated in 2001, and named after H. Richard Niebuhr because H. Richard Niebuhr was on the faculty here at YDS. Another fun fact, in this photograph, that's Katie Cannon delivering endowed lectures here shortly before she passed away. I was there, so just to tie all the strands together, right, of our class, Katie Cannon in Niebuhr Hall lecturing. So, but I want to begin by talking about Reinhold Niebuhr. So Reinhold Niebuhr was the older of the two brothers, and it seems to have been burdened with a bit of insecurity throughout his life because he did not have a PhD, and his brother had a PhD. But despite not having a PhD, he taught at Union Seminary, and he was a very influential public theologian, a public figure that was able to influence the common conversation at the time, of course, in part because cultural Christianity was stronger in that particular cultural moment than now. So he experienced a really interesting kind of evolution of his thinking over the course of his career. In the 1920s, he was very committed to the working class. He had sympathies with socialism, with pacifism. Like many thinkers coming out of World War I, there was this devotion to pacifism, desire to have World War I be the war to end all wars. But as time went on, he came to see socialism and pacifism and also liberalism and the social gospel, we'll talk more about the social gospel later in the semester, as dangerously idealistic. Lovely ideas, but dangerous ideas, because they cannot be implemented in the world that we experience. That was his conviction. So he advocates this position of Christian realism, and I'll come back and say more about Christian realism. But he became then very influential with this approach of Christian realism in national political affairs in the 1940s and the 1950s. And think about what is happening at that period, post-World War II. It's the height of U.S. anti-communism. So somebody who had these liberal socialist leanings early on in his career becomes someone who's very, very bound up with the U.S. anti-communist frenzy of the era. And his core idea is that only by recognizing the entrenched character of human selfishness and human self-interestedness can we actually have a hope of advancing social justice. His most famous quote is the one that's up here, that our capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but our inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. He also, talked about democracy as the least bad of the political options available. So this is kind of the aura of Christian realism. We look on the dark side of human nature in order to achieve what is realistically possible in the world in which we live. So I'll come back to Reinhold Niebuhr a little bit later. H. Richard Niebuhr, remember we did talk about Christ and culture early on in the semester, so that is one of the important works of H. Richard Niebuhr, and this whole notion of a typology for thinking through ways in which Christians have related Christ and culture. His PhD was from Yale in 1924. He taught at Yale then from 1931 to 1962. He was very influential as an academic theologian. He was not a public figure like his brother, so they both had reasons to be insecure. He could look to his brother as being the more publicly influential figure. So the responsible self is broadly considered to be his most, probably Christ and culture may be more widely read, but most would say that the responsible self is his most significant contribution. He thought of it as articulating a Christian ethic that was consistent with radical monotheism. Why radical monotheism? Well, like his brother, there was a kind of reaction to the social gospel, to liberal theology, a disillusionment with those. And in his case, it was that they were seen as fundamentally anthropocentric, fundamentally focused on the human and on human experience. So radical monotheism was a corrective to that. What we tend to do in our anthropocentrism is to remake Christianity in accord with our own cultural ideals. We domesticate Christianity. We domesticate God. We domesticate Jesus. And so we come out with a Christianity that's very comfortable with capitalism, very comfortable with nationalism, very comfortable with militarism, and so on. And so radical monotheism seeks to allow God to stand in judgment on all of these cultural ideals. So that is that concern is a broadly Barthian concern, something that H. Richard Niebuhr kind of absorbed from Barth and carried into his own thought. But at the same time, H. Richard Niebuhr was very conscious of our historically conditioned situatedness, that in seeking to allow God to stand over against our cultural ideals and stand in judgment on them, we have a very limited vision. We have a vision that's shaped by our own historical context, our own capacity to grasp in what sense our ideas are conditioned and parochial and so on. So it's not an easy thing to open up that space for hearing the radical transcendence of God in the midst of our own filtered vision of reality. So he's struggling to think through what radical monotheism looks like then on the ground in relationship to Christian ethics. He's also trying to move beyond utilitarianism and deontology at a time when virtue ethics has not yet come on the scene. So he doesn't reach for that as a third alternative, but he is conscious that these are the two central ways of thinking ethically, and he's dissatisfied with both of them. The way he thinks through this is in terms of what he calls symbolic fields or symbolic forms. And he says, well, there's this notion of the human being as a maker with agency, right? Capable of transforming the world in order to realize ideals. And this activist orientation, he thought, that aligns with utilitarianism. That's what utilitarianism thinks, you could transform the world, bring about the right state of affairs, the right consequences. And then he thinks, well, there's an alternate symbolic form, which is sees the human being fundamentally as citizen standing within an established order in which there are laws and there are principles, and what you are to do is to obey those and to enact them. So he thought that symbolic form aligned with a deontological orientation. And he's reaching for something beyond these, and he articulates that as the human being as responder. So when he talks about responsibility, he's thinking fundamentally about responding. That's not necessarily how we tend to think about responsibility, right? But it's always about responding for H. Richard Niebuhr. So the responsible life, not the ideal life and not the dutiful life. Why? Well, his core notion is that human beings have this highly conditioned agency. Conditioned historically, conditioned culturally, conditioned by all sorts of forces. Within that, we have a kind of agency, but it's highly constrained. So human being as maker, promoting the ideal life, he thought that exaggerates the scope of human agency. Really, we're not able to realize all goods. We can envision a host of goods that we can't actually realize. And he thought that this notion of human being as citizen shrunk the scope of human agency too much. Like, I'm just going to obey the rules, just going to follow the commands that are given. Too rigid, too simplified. And so instead is this third space. Like, what is this space of the responder, the responding agent? He tries to articulate the space of human agency as one in which we are affected by and also affecting everything and everyone around us. We're operating in this complex field. We inhabit circumstances that we can't control and that we cannot really fundamentally transform. What we do then is we interpret everything that's going on around us, and we respond. And this is a creative process of limited freedom. It's not as simple as just following pre-given rules. He comes up with this neologism of alteraction. Alteraction. So our actions are not unconditioned. It's like, I'm the agent, I'm going to act. And alteraction is always responsive. It's like, I'm responding to an action upon myself, but I respond with something that is agency. And this is, for him, a Christian way of acting. How so? Because in Christ Jesus, we see this responsible life perfected. So he thinks Jesus, too, is in this complex field of forces that are acting upon him, and he is responding to all of these things. And he gives us a perfect illustration of responding to all of these forces, and also as fully divine as well as fully human. As fully divine, Jesus is God's way of making possible what would otherwise be impossible for us. So in all of Jesus' responses, in all of his respondings, he is doing what fits into the divine action. So what's the divine action? Where do we see the divine action? Well, here Niebuhr was very much thinking of God's action as in all things, a kind of panentheist notion of divine agency. So not pantheist, God isn't collapsed into the world, but God is immanent in all things. And so the task of the responder, of the human being as a responder, is to try to discern how God is acting in all things and how to respond to this messy, messy reality around us as a response to God. So he talks about God as the universal that contains and transforms, that includes and fashions every particular. Kind of a notion of universal providence that's operating through all things, but not in an easily discernible way. So we might think of Miguel de la Torre early in the semester asking in that cycle of Christian ethics, what is going on here? And when Niebuhr is asking what is going on here, he's saying, what is God doing in all this messiness of reality? So if the sources of authority for Christian ethics are scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, Niebuhr seems to be looking to experience in a major way, but not as in liberation theology, so much the experience of the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized, but the experience of, think of his historical moment, disillusioned Western progressive humanity, right, in this moment of the late 20th century, of being very disillusioned with what is possible in terms of progress and transformation. And also a desire to be modern, a desire to be scientific, an unease with supernatural things. So where do we find God most? In reality, right? We don't find God primarily by looking to the supernatural, but by looking to natural events, historical events, what's going on in history, what's going on in culture. And in the midst of this very disillusioned time, this very confusing time, he thinks that to be Christian is to be able to trust in God's activity in and through all this messiness. That Jesus makes it possible for us to trust in this inscrutable power that is in all things, to be at home in this demythologized world that feels so alien to God's purposes, and to trust that God's purposes are active in this otherwise seemingly strange and empty world. So Lovin makes two constructive contributions here, kind of responding to H. Richard Niebuhr and his responsibility ethics. First of all, he says, maybe the virtues would have helped H. Richard Niebuhr, because this sounds kind of amorphous. Like, responsibility, I'm going to just be responsible in all things. And the virtues might have been a way to give some definition to this, in terms of defining what does proper responsiveness look like in different contexts. Because the virtues are always attending to the specificity of various contexts and structuring them in various ways. And the other is to say that synergy, integrity, liberation, and realism, those four variations on the Christian stance, can be mutually complementary. So he wants to say those four stances that can seem mutually exclusive, if you take a page from H. Richard Niebuhr, might be somehow integrated as moments in this process of responsibility, of being responsible people, deciding what our goals are, what our duties are. When we make which kind of decision, we are becoming responsible people, and we're drawing on all moments of the Christian stance. All right, other Niebuhr, back to Reinhold and Reinhold's Christian realism. So a core idea here was, as important as Jesus is for defining Christian ethics, Jesus sets out a love ethic, which is impossible. It's impossible. It should be an ideal. It should somehow guide us. It should somehow inspire us. But we should not try to put it into practice in history, in our society. It's focused, it's a personal ethic. It's not a social ethic. It asks for perfect disinterestedness. It asks for non-resistance to evil. It's never focused on securing certain results or outcomes. And Niebuhr says, we actually sometimes do need to resist evil. We do need to be concerned about consequences. We rightly feel the pull of this ideal, but we shouldn't try to live by it. So think back to our discussion of the Sermon on the Mount and various ways of reading the Sermon on the Mount. He wants to read Christian ethics broadly construed as this sort of ideal reading of the Sermon on the Mount. It draws us, it inspires us in some way, but don't put it into practice. It's a disaster. If we try to convert the love ethic of Jesus into a social ethic, he thought, we arrive at anarchism or we arrive at communism, and he thought both of these had been proven to be a disastrous, historically speaking. So again, remember, post-World War II period, anti-communist era, he's very disillusioned with what human beings have done. World War II, massive loss of life. So human beings are ineradicably self-interested. Emphasis on human fallenness. And this self-interestedness is exacerbated at the group level. So we might transcend interest in me, myself, and I But we transcend it by building up loyalty to a group, to our family, to our nation, to our soccer club. And then that becomes the site for collective self-interested actions that are unjust to others. It's not devotion to the common good, it's devotion to some group. Could be our co-religionists, right? We're devoted to some group. So what do we need? We need justice. The love ethic of Jesus is an inspiration, but what we need here and now is justice. And what does justice do? Justice adjudicates conflicting claims in an imperfect world. There are conflicts. There are ineradicable conflicts. There will never be harmony this side of the eschaton. We are going to have to make tragic choices, and we're going to be left with regret. And if we deny this ineradicable character of conflict, we are going to be cloaking injustice. We should expect that people will advocate for systems and institutions that favor themselves and favor their groups, their in-groups. And the best thing that we can do as Christians operating in this world is to acknowledge that self-interestedness and its ineradicable character and create fairer policies that adjudicate these conflicts. Kind of a cutting quote here. A just society is not going to be built by a little more education and a few more sermons on love. And he thinks that asserting the rights of the disinherited is incompatible with a love ethic. So, very strong claim here. It's incompatible with a love ethic. And yet, we should be asserting the rights of the disinherited. And we should be prepared to use coercion in order to establish those rights. So if Jesus indeed preached non-resistance to evil, which is what he thought, Jesus preached non-resistance to evil, then nonviolent resistance is still resistance. It's still not the love ethic of Jesus. So he thought that's like a subterfuge. You think you're following Jesus because you're using nonviolent resistance. It's still resistance. And he thinks we're justified in using resistance to evil, to injustice. We're justified, in fact, in using violent resistance to evil because we occupy a fallen world. Uncomfortable thoughts to sit with. He's very aware of the operations of privilege in society. We can't wait, he thought, for voluntary action on the part of the privileged members of a community to bring about social justice. Again, don't expect the sermons to lead the privileged to voluntarily give up their privilege. And if we don't bring about social justice by coercing the privileged to give up their privilege, then resentment will grow on the part of those who are on the underside of social inequalities. And that resentment will grow until it issues in violent revolt and hatred. And so we have a responsibility to create social policies that are going to restrict power and privilege and prevent those inequalities from reaching the point at which violent revolt will issue forth. Don't just rely on goodwill. Don't rely on the sermons. So in a sense, he tends to focus more on the powerful and the privileged because he thinks that's the point we need to dismantle. We need to dismantle the structures that are according that kind of privilege. And we need to expect that there will be covert use of force and there will be hypocritical pretension of virtue. So we come back to our case. Thoughts about what H. Richard Niebuhr might say to this case, what Reinhold Niebuhr might say to this. So I know we are at time. Just closing the loop to come back to Hartman. You know, is she saying responsibility is not a virtue, responsibility is not a good thing? Well, and it's a lot more complicated than that, but certainly what she's saying is responsibility is not a merely individual thing. So to set people free and say, okay, we're now going to hold you responsible for what you do without giving any social support, any social resources, is a farce, right? And so how does that fit with what H. Richard Niebuhr is saying, which seems to be all about responsibility? Well, he's attentive to this whole complex network of forces in which you're embedded. And so, I mean, obviously he's not having a conversation with Saidiya Hartman, but I think they could have a very fruitful conversation in which he would say, yes, absolutely, holding individuals responsible in contexts where there are no resources that allow them to meet the expectations that are being placed upon them is a horrible distortion of the ideal of responsibility that he is holding up, this kind of responsiveness in the midst of a very complex array of forces. That's it. Thank you very much.